Okay, this lecture is going to be on Carl Sagan's article, Does Truth Matter? I believe this was published in the mid-'80s. And it's an article about the difference between science as a belief system for people versus the many other belief systems that people have. And he calls those other belief systems pseudoscience, which is basically not science. And in this article, he is going to argue for science over other types of belief systems. So let's get into it. He begins by stating that science has beauty, power, and majesty that can provide spiritual as well as practical fulfillment. So this is his thesis, is that science should be a place where we find many times often the way that most religions would say that in the world we can find the power and the beauty and majesty of God and his creation. Well, Sagan is arguing the same thing here for science. And he's also saying that it practically fulfills our needs, which gives us answers that we need for life, but it also gives us spiritual fulfillment, which is those other answers that fill the voids in us, like for our spirit or for our soul. He continues to write that superstition and pseudoscience keep getting in the way, that they provide very easy answers and casually press our buttons and basically cheapen the entire experience. So his question, or his, to answer in this article is, if we care about what is true, does truth really matter to people? And he cites this poet Thomas Gray, who wrote, "Where ignorance is bliss, it is folly to be wise," which is basically means that where people are generally ignorant of the truth and don't want the truth because they are happy as it is, that it would be foolish to be the wise person, which is kind of this topsy-turvy perspective that in a world of ignorance, smart people and those people who question things would be considered fools, which should be the opposite, obviously. And then he goes on to explain this dilemma better by citing this quote: "It is morally as bad not to care whether a thing is true or not, so long as it makes you feel good, as it is not to care about how you got your money as long as you've got it." So that the end justifies the means, that we as human beings don't really need to understand the process of how things happen, so long as we're satisfied with the end result. And then he continues in his article by saying it's really disheartening to discover the government corruption and incompetence, but is it better not to know about it? What interest does not knowing things serve? If we as humans bear, say, hereditary propensities towards the hatred of strangers, isn't self-knowledge the only antidote? So you see, he's setting up all of these theoretical questions here, and this is what he serves, or he intends to answer here. He begins by going into the genealogy of morals by Friedrich Nietzsche, who was a German philosopher. German, not Austrian, I think. And he cites this quotation from Nietzsche saying, "Unbroken progress in the self-belittling of man brought about by the scientific revolution," that Nietzsche mourns the loss of man's belief in his own dignity, his uniqueness, in his irreplaceability in the scheme of existence. And Sagan writes, "For me, it is far better to grasp the universe as it is than to persist in this delusion, whether it's satisfying or reassuring," that he would rather know the real truth of life, even if it hurts, even if it stings, even if it's disappointing even, because to live in this kind of delusion of our perception, regardless of how satisfying and reassuring and how safe it makes us feel, will eventually cause some kind of bubble to burst, because if it's not true, then eventually we will find out. And again, he follows up with these series of theoretical questions. And now he's going to give some examples in the rest of the essay about these places where we have put our confidence in other kinds of belief systems rather than science as a method itself. So he gives this example of discovering that the universe is actually older than it is, provides some other kinds of benefits to us, like improving our appreciation of its sweep and grandeur, to entertain the notion that we are a particularly complex arrangement of atoms and not some breath of divinity, at the very least enhances our respect for atoms, right? And to discover, as now seems probable, that our planet is one of billions of others in the galaxy, that our galaxy is one of billions more, it kind of majestically expands the arena of what is possible. To find that our ancestors were also ancestors of apes ties us to the rest of life and makes possible important reflections on human nature. So that even if we discover something new about the origins of the universe or ourselves, it should actually make us appreciate ourselves and the universe more, rather than kind of be disheartened by some kind of truth that we were led to not believe initially. And then he says, but superstition and pseudoscience keep getting in the way. They distract us. They provide easy answers. They dodge skeptical scrutiny. They casually press our buttons of awe, and they kind of cheapen the experience of life for us in routine, comfortable practitioners, as well as victims of credulity. He says, yes, the world would be a more interesting place if there were UFOs lurking in the deep waters off Bermuda and eating ships and planes, or if dead people could take control of our hands and write us messages. So he's talking about all of these things that have not been proven that people really believe in. He goes on to give other instances of pseudoscience. Here he writes, pseudoscience is easier to contrive than science because distracting confrontations with reality are more readily avoided, where we don't want to see things as they are, so we naturally avoid those things. He says, naturally, people try various different belief systems on for size to see if they help, right? People experiment with belief systems like different religions, or maybe astrology or meditation. He says that pseudoscience speaks to very powerful emotional needs that science often leaves unfulfilled. It caters to our fantasies and our idea of personal powers that we lack. Even stuff like comic book heroes and other manifestations satisfy spiritual hungers and cures for disease, and promises that death is not the end for us. And it reassures us that our cosmic centrality, this idea that humans are kind of the center of the universe, and really important. It vouches that we are hooked up with, tied to the entire universe. So if something bad would happen to us, then something bad would happen to the universe. So it makes us feel very important. He gives his own example of believing in this comic book kind of a card reader magician called Zatara, that Zatara could make anything happen. And he said he also believed on this when he was a child. And pseudoscience is embraced, it might be argued, in exact proportion as actual science is misunderstood, except that the language breaks down. If you've never heard of science, then you could hardly be aware that you're embracing something that is not science. You're simply thinking in one of the ways that humans have always had, either some kind of religious system, often state-protected nursery of pseudoscience, that, governments protect religions. We have the freedom of religion in our country, and because it's very important to human beings to have that freedom to choose what they want to believe. In a way, it's an artifact from times long ago, and in some countries, nearly everyone believes in something else, like not a religion per se, but astrology, or that there are people who could tell the future, like precognition. Even government leaders have been confirmed to believe in these kinds of things, different presidents of other countries, and even our own. He says most of the case histories I'll relate are American because those are the ones that he knows best. He gives sites about a psychic spoonbender, someone who's channeling from Israel, someone who was helping between Muslim fundamentalists in Algeria, that high French officials, including the president, arranged for millions of dollars to be invested in a scam to find new petroleum reserves in the air, that even in Germany there was a concern about earth rays. He gives examples again in the Philippines and in Britain and Japan about ghosts, in Tokyo about ESP and other leaders, and witches being burned in South Africa. All of these different belief systems that people have that really is life and death in other kinds of cultures, right? He said perhaps the most recent global science by many is already a religion. It's the Hindu doctrine of transcendental meditation. And he talks about how this kind of meditation, although it's very old, has become very popular again. And then it actually has become a very big money-making scheme for people who are giving money to these leaders who are teaching them this kind of meditation. So he's giving all of these examples about how government is kind of even now trying to rein in the use of pseudoscience and science to help control population. He says that in places where religion was kind of banned, specifically Russian communism, except for the kind of superstition that the state was all powerful, it was advertised as scientific, but fell short of this ideal as the most unself-critical mystery cult, the Russian government. That critical thinking, except by scientists, was recognized as dangerous, and critical thinking was not taught in schools, and it was even punished when expressed. And as a result, now in post-communism, many Russians view science with suspicion. When the lid was lifted, it was also the true virulent of ethnic hatreds. It kind of created a hatred between different kinds of people in Russia, perhaps even Ukraine and Russia, as we see tensions now rising, even currently. Again, in China, they decided that it was very dangerous for people to believe other things. And so in 1794, they decided to reinvest in the education of the country by getting rid of science and superstition and really teaching science as a method, towards technology, as an important sign of accomplishment of a country, giving to economic development and scientific advance, writing that we must be attentive and implement such public education as part of a strategy to modernize our socialist country and make our nation powerful and prosperous.